on our Homes for Our Future website. Before we get started with our main event and our speakers, Ryan and Stephanie, I just wanted to take a little bit of time to share a couple updates, just because we haven't really had a chance to see each other or talk over the last several months in many cases. We've been really busy since all of this happened um, in terms of our programming and staffing changes. We are working really closely with state partners um, and agencies and legislators, both in our region and throughout the state, to talk about housing needs in the near term and the long term, along with potential solutions. So that's been well received and has been taking a lot of our time and focus. But we've also launched a new program in the city of Charlevoix, which you may have heard about through our newsletters and through the media, where we're using housing conservancy tools like deed restrictions to ensure the long-term year-round availability of homes in the city of Charlevoix, modeled after a program in Vail. At the same time, we've also continued to build our communications resources and are planning a second sort of launch for the Homes for Our Future campaign that was just getting off the ground before social distancing began. And at the same time, we've been distilling data from the 2019 target market analysis into two-page fact sheets for each county, which are available on the Housing North website. If you haven't gotten a chance to check those out, you might want to take a look. But most importantly, we've added two really amazing people to the Housing North team. Steve Schnell, the Charlevoix County Housing Ready Program Director, started in March, and Yarrow Brown, Housing North's new Executive Director, who just started last week. Both of them have come on board in very strange circumstances, but have proven to be really adaptable and flexible as they begin their jobs in this new altered state of reality. I'm really grateful to have both of them on board, and I'm really looking forward to working with them over the next few months as we transition our responsibilities and get started on Housing North's next phase. With that, I'd like to give Yarrow the chance to introduce herself, just so you can all start to get to know her. Yarrow, as I mentioned, just started last week and has been a great colleague, even virtually. So happy to have her on board. Yarrow, I don't know if you are able to say a few words. I just wanted to give you the chance to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I just want to say hi to everybody. I'm really excited to be here. It's been definitely interesting to onboard this position while remote, hanging out in my basement, my new office. But I'm really excited about everything we're working on, the new programs we're developing, and a lot of the policy initiatives. I still have a lot to learn. I'm very grateful for Sarah and Steve onboarding me during this time. And feel free to reach out at any point. I'm going to enjoy this webinar, and I'm here to answer any questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Steve, I don't want to put you on the spot, but also wanted to give you a chance to introduce yourself. He's been working, as I mentioned, since March in Charlevoix County, and again, has just been a great colleague to have on board, particularly as we navigate a brand new program in Charlevoix County.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, it's been an exciting time to start a new job. Having about 20 minutes spent in my office before being kicked out and working from home, but it's definitely lent an extra air of urgency to our work. So I'm really excited to be part of this, and some great communities here in Charlevoix County to be working with. So I look forward to it.
And then I also want to just let everyone know Lisette Reyes, who many of you have known or connected with over the last several months, who's been helping us with our communications. She's here with us today and is going to help facilitate the questions and the discussions after both presentations are complete. So just want to let Lisette say hello so everyone knows who you are. If she's available. Okay. I think we've had some intermittent internet issues, which is a good time for me to say that, as I mentioned earlier, this is all kind of an experiment, and we fully expect some hiccups as we go through this. So I appreciate your patience as we navigate this new format. So as to that end, just a couple quick reminders, just to make sure it runs as smoothly as possible. If you could make sure that you're muted, it looks like everybody is. And if you have any questions, please share them over chat with Lisette. At the end of both presentations, we'll go through those questions that have been submitted. So with that, I am going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker, Stephanie McGreevy of the Mackinac Island Community Foundation. I first talked with Stephanie a few months ago, I think, about a project that she's been leading in Mackinac Island. It's an interesting project that features some really unique partnerships between philanthropy, local government, and a community development finance institution. And I think that there's a lot of great lessons for our communities to learn from her work on Mackinac Island. So with that, I'd like to introduce Stephanie McGreevy. And thanks for being here today, Stephanie, virtually.
Are we on now?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I really appreciate you inviting me. I'm always, as I've done in the past with community foundations, shared our story, shared our woes about housing, and I'm always, again, like to share it. First, I just want to ask everyone to virtually raise your hand if you've ever been to Mackinac Island. All right. I know I see a few of you raising your hand. You know, it's one thing to know that you've been to Mackinac Island, you've been on Main Street, but there's probably not a lot of people that recognize that Mackinac Island has 250 permanently occupied residents on the island, housing a year-round population of approximately 500 individuals. And it's those individuals that are charged with maintaining the island, keeping the island ready for the influx of workers, the residents, and the tourists. And it's these residents that provide a wide variety of services. They make sure that the businesses are running and that the infrastructure is running. Further, they take care of our police, our fire, our healthcare, our public works, the park and the dock maintenance, and our city government, which all continue to run the off-season. Our residents have children and they require an education system that, again, operates in the off-season. And the island has its own school district with pre-K through 12th grade program with less than 80 students. Commuting to the island in the off-season is not practical and is often not possible. In order for it to function as Michigan's premier destination, a stable base of permanent residents is required. And over the past 25 years, the Community Foundation has recognized that as a part of their strategic plan. And the city of Mackinac Island has also recognized it as a part of their master plan, this lack of housing. But then the question has to become, how did we get to this point? What happened to this affordable housing? The two houses in front of you were both, well, the house on the right was built in the 40s and 50s. It was an island family that lived in it. The house to the left of it was originally identical. Both homes were year-round, second-generation islanders. Many of those had been working at the Moral Rearmament, which was a large organization during the 60s. They had a population of over 900 one winter. Those organizations employed many families, allowing them to purchase homes throughout the island. But during the 80s and 90s, many of those homes were sold. They were sold, such as the one on the left, demolished, and a second home was built. for the tourist industry or for the summer home industry. This house raised 9 children. Most of the children left the island, but a few left. When they sold, they left the island and it was sold to Grand Hotel as employee housing. And that was, that happened to many of the homes. These are downtown homes, but many homes in the village happened as well. Many of these people didn't have a pension. And so this was a part of their retirement to sell these homes. None of these children of this widow could afford to buy it, but yet she was able to leave the island and again, be able to live comfortably. You see 3 large houses in front of you. Before those houses were built, there was a cement block apartments, 6 of them, that had grocery store workers, small project carpenters, and now those 3 homes are used for 4 months out of the year. This home, again in the downtown area, housed 3 year-round households. It was sold and is now used for employee housing for 4 months out of the year. As you can see, my point is that many of those rentals that had been available in the 80s and 90s have now either been sold to be used for employee housing or for restricted housing or for seasonal second homes. Also, many of these homes are now, a home now is being sold for $399,000 for a 1-bedroom condo, and single family homes are $950,000 to $1.9 million. So the City of Mackinac Island and the Community Foundation recognized there was a need, but we needed to better clarify what the exact needs of the community were. The City of Mackinac Island created a committee to explore these options. Mackinac Island Community Foundation entrusted me to also begin the exploration of rental and home ownership about 4 years ago. Through my research, I discovered and encountered CNAIR. CNAIR is a CDFI, a community development financial institution out of Lansing and Detroit. They're private sector financial intermediaries with community development as their primary mission. CNAIR had assisted Mackinac Island in the late 90s with a MISHDA affordable homeowner project. So the committee gave them a call. The gentleman on the left is Mark McDaniels, is president and CEO, and Mark Erickson on the right is the general counsel. The 2 of them, along with a couple of other the CNAIR staff, came to one of the city's committees to discuss the options and the criteria. But the biggest question was, what housing did we need? Did we need 50 units, 100 units? Who needed these units? Where would we put those units? There's a lot of questions that we need to start answering. Mackinac Island Community Foundation staff created a survey. Oh, and by the way, we have a staff of 1.5. We created a survey that identified the household, their needs, how many were in the household, and their average income. The goal of that winter was to understand who needed housing and what kind. Did we need rentals? Did we need home ownership? What was the income level, low, middle, high? All the information was kept confidential and redacted here at the Community Foundation. And then we turned everything over to the Community Research Services, which in turn gave us an executive summary in the summer of, in July of 2017, and a full report in December of 2017. We recognized that we had gotten a lot of data with a lot of stories. Our market analysis showed that the average household size was 2. The average income per person was $38,950. And as you can see, the average age was 35. We found that only 2 households were actually eligible for income restricted rentals. And we only had 1 household that had more than 2. It was a family of 4. And I have to say, this was the whole reason to do the market analysis. All of the rumors of what we wanted for housing was wrong. Nothing that everybody said that we kept getting information-wise didn't ever fit. We finally had real numbers to be able to present to the public. After Senair had gotten the information, they came back to us in 2017, and this is what they suggested that Mackinac Island develop: 12 to 24 units, townhomes of 1,000 square feet, a targeted income again 32,000, and as you can see, the pricing. They also suggested that the probable cost of these 12 units would be $2.5 million. With a rent, and this would have to be the market price rent, we would still be a shortfall of $2 million. So we recognized that we had a lack of housing for new residents and second generation households. So now, so great, we know what we need, but now we need to create it. We needed to identify a location. Over 80% of the island is a state park. Very few 2-acre parcels are available, and zoning could have been an issue. We certainly recognize that some residential areas may not have been very interested in having a lot of higher density next to their home. So the committee sat down and started looking at the land use map. All of the white that you see on this is a state park. Blue is infrastructure. The long blue is an airport. The green is recreation area. Pink is commercial. You can see down at the bottom, very bottom, pink is Grand Hotel. To the right, the pink is the Mission Point Resort. So if you look a little deeper, what we're looking for is brown. Brown is zoned housing, high density. And that was what we were looking for throughout the island. And as you can see, there's not that much. At this Stone Cliff area, we did identify a piece of property. Just next to the blue is a brown, and it's called Green Shed Lane. A developer owner the year previously had been working with an organization called Westpac Communities. Westpac is a developer and a builder that works with student housing and many other building developments. They put in a plan to put in employee housing, 100+ units, and nothing year-round. The units would be rented to employers, not to households. They also had been told that because of the density, that they would have to have a drain field. And the drain field with the units would have to be quite large. Also, that particular area is a part of a watershed that goes, if you look to the left, where the little Hart's Trail is, just to the right of that is the Browns Brook. So the public outcry was intense as they felt that it would be an environmental disaster to have this drain field above Browns Brook and ruining Browns Brook and again, creating a pollution problem. They took it to the DEQ, and eventually though, the developer and the owners withdrew the plans for that year. Fortunately, that became a potential site for the city. From the sky, let's see. Takes a little bit. Okay. Negotiations began in the fall of 2017 to purchase the property. It had the acreage and it had the zoning. The zoning was hotel boarding. It also had the infrastructure. Right next to the property between the airport, which is that that cement pad that you see there, ran water, sewer, and electricity. The next question was, how would it be funded? Mackinac Island Community Foundation had a field of interest fund that was dedicated to preserving open space. We ran through the scenario of granting to the city of Mackinac Island for the purchase of the property. This would ensure that the property would not become high-density employee housing originally planned and would still be able to provide a space for year-round housing. The purchase price was $420,000, with the Community Foundation providing $250,000 grant, with the city also using monies from their own general fund. The deal was signed April 1st, 2018. The ball was rolling. That spring, Brad Williams of ASL Architects, Craig Moulton of Oakwood Construction, and again, Mark McDaniels and Mark Erickson of Sonair visited the island to start creating preliminary drawings. This was the concept: townhomes. Each unit would have a lower level with a garage originally. A separate building was later designed for off-season snowmobiles and bicycles. The second floor would have 2 bedrooms and a washer and dryer and a full bath. After some time with each of the groups, this was the final building layout. In the end, we chose to do 4 buildings, spread it out. Each of the units would have 1 3-bedroom. Even though the market analysis said that we did not need one, the city continued to push for families. And so right now, each building has 1, but on the end of each building, there's potential for a 3rd bedroom. Also, at the back of the lot, there is an employee housing, and they put the storage sheds, which would store the snowmobiles, along the back wall to create a buffer between the 2 buildings. So now we're getting to the point where who gets to live there? How are we going to rent these units? We continue to go back to the Aspen-Pitkin County Housing Authority. They were an amazing resource for us. I called them many times, and their guidelines are online. They rent thousands of units, and they also do home ownership restrictions. And they've been in the business for over 40 years. So a subcommittee was created that was dedicated to the application and resident selection criteria. After many meetings, we took the full guidelines to the housing committee. And after that, it went into the city council. Our goal is to make sure that we were providing for workforce housing and not second homeowners, retirees, or seasonal workers. So the resident selection criteria. We recognize that applicants and residents must work 1,500 hours annually on the island. That's about 3/4 of the year. Residents must reside in the unit for a minimum of 11 months of the calendar year. They also cannot, they shall not own any other developed residential property on Mackinac Island. The residents need to be requalified every 2 years. And first consideration will be given to emergency workers. Those are on call, our police, our fire, our medical, and our utility. And of course, the question is always, how do you finance it? And this is where philanthropy and government came together again. We looked at many of the different options. Mackinac Island did not fit the criteria for any of MISH's programs. The Community Foundation sat down with MISH's director multiple times to explore the options. We sat down with the USDA. But at the end of the day, while our county was didn't have the wealth, the zip code of 49757 it had a very strong base. There was discrepancies among incomes within the residents, but not enough for any programming. Sinair, again, went to bat for us and tried to work with the MEDC and the Michigan's Community Capital Fund to see if there would be any programming dollars available. And again, it was a no-go. The city would need to create its own funding with a capital improvement bond. Before that year, though, Mackinac Island had never had a bond or borrowed money for the city infrastructure, except for the Department of Public Works for water structures. So they had the credit available to them. The total project would be $2.77 million. Mackinac Community Foundation had done the original $250,000 property purchase grant. And then again, the Community Foundation recognized that it wasn't enough for us to just say that we thought this was important. We recognized that we had to make sure that our unrestricted dollars went into this as well too. So over 2 years, this year and last year, we did a grant for, and I apologize, it was actually $190,000. The city contributed $270,000 from their general funds and received a 2020 capital improvement bond of $2,070,000. That bond is for 15 years. It was 2.700%, and it came from Huntington Public Capital Corporation. These are the finished houses. And I'm gonna do a little walkthrough. This was last summer, on the left. It comes through for you. Still wooded. And this was, I think, I mean, I guess the end of March, but before COVID-19 hit. That's it. And Is that, hold on, sorry. Okay. And this was one of the last photos I got of the kitchen going in. Obviously the workers have not been here, but they'll return on Monday. And the goal is to have the residents start moving in on June 1st. They'll be bringing up 4 workers on Monday. So that is is a big thank you. We could not have done this project without Scenair. They were just an amazing, they worked with our city a huge amount. Oakwood Construction, Craig Moulton, Margaret Dowd, she was behind this all the way, and I had key people throughout in our city government that were willing to push this through. And also, I just have to say, you need somebody to be that squeaky wheel in all of this. And the Community Foundation made sure that we were there at every meeting to make sure that this project happened. I've always said I have a little byline that I'm not much of a community foundation if I don't have a community. And so I've always felt that this is extremely important that we get this housing project up and running. And thanks. Sarah?
Hey, thank you, Stephanie. You know, when I first heard about this project, I was super excited about it because it sounds like you guys were able to put together some financing opportunities that we haven't really delved into at great length here in our region. And so I think we have some questions about that for the discussion later on, but just want to thank you again for your presentation and all your work on this project. It's very similar in concept to the types of housing that we talk about in our region. You know, that lower end of the workforce that's makes just a little bit too much money to be considered low income, but not enough to actually qualify for a mortgage or to be able to afford market rate rents. So finding that sweet spot in terms of rents and then being able to fill the financing gap that always exists is a real challenge. So your project, I think, has a lot of lessons for us moving forward. And thanks again for being here. I'm going to introduce Ryan Kilpatrick. Some of you have heard from Ryan in the past. He's the executive director of Housing Next and has been a part of our housing summits in the past to talk about the work that they're doing in West Michigan around creating more housing development opportunities. And he has been gracious enough to share with us today his experience with building a housing fund in West Michigan to talk about where some of those dollars are coming from and how they'll be used and what they're looking at moving forward. So with that, I'll introduce Ryan. Thanks for joining us today, Ryan.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. I'm just waiting for my PowerPoint to let me turn this into slideshow mode. But for now, I think a lot of you have probably heard me speak before, so I'm not going to give you the whole background on what we do more broadly. I'm going to talk much more specifically about the investment funds that we've been working on. There we go. So when Housing Next was first created, we knew that we had a lot of work to do with our local units of government around zoning and barriers to creating housing. But we also knew that there was really no way to get enough housing stock to come online at the price point that we needed it without some form of non-traditional gap financing. It was really clear that there was a gap in the marketplace, and without being able to fill that gap, we weren't going to find the solutions that we really wanted. So over the last 2 years, in addition to working on what I'm about to talk to you today, we've also spent a lot of time working with traditional developers to make sure that we're getting enough market rate product in the pipeline. We had a housing needs assessment conducted in 2018 where we found we needed more than 7,500 additional units countywide. And a lot of those units that we needed were in that middle market and kind of higher end market rate both for sale and for rent. And for as long as we weren't creating an adequate amount of market rate supply, those potential market rate renters were dipping down into the naturally occurring affordable housing. And they were out competing less affluent renters for essentially the same product. And they were willing to pay the extra $100, $150 a month in order to compete for that product. And so they were essentially dropping down in the marketplace below what they could afford. Instead of spending 30% of their income, they were spending 15 or 20% of their income. But what they were doing then is pushing our workforce out of the housing market. They were making it much more difficult for our workforce to find housing. And that's honestly still happening to a great extent. But what we've been able to do in partnership with local municipalities, our Chamber of Commerce, our Economic Development Authority, the county, is we've gotten a little over 2,000 new market rate units in the pipeline across Ottawa County. A lot of those are in the Holland-Zeeland market area. A couple hundred of them are going to be in the Grand Haven Spring Lake area. I'm going to knock on wood and say that we think all those projects are still moving forward. Some of them have continued on with construction in the last couple of days after a hiatus due to COVID-19. Others are still working to secure all of their financing, but a big component of this, I just want to be clear, is making sure that you've got an adequate amount of market rate housing coming online. You're really encouraging those potential market rate renters to stay in that more traditional market rate category by designing projects in close proximity to high quality amenities so that they're not tempted to continue to dip down into that more naturally occurring affordable housing. So with that said, when Housing Next was created, our intent was, hey, no problem. We're just going to set up a $10 million gap fund, and that'll be easy. And we made hard work of that, and frankly, just didn't have the confidence from our investor community to put together $10 million right off the bat. The Holland-Zeeland Community Foundation was an extraordinary partner. They were all in. They worked with us and Lakeshore Advantage, our economic development partner, to try to pull investors in. We had a lot of meetings with CEOs and CFOs, and everybody said, yes, we want to invest. And they also said, show us you know what you're doing before we commit to $1 or $2 or $3 million to this fund. So we backpedaled and said, okay, that actually makes a fair amount of sense. Let's set up an initial investment fund with a target of $1 to $2 million, where we'll do property acquisition and pre-development to get projects that otherwise aren't getting done across the finish line, whether it's local zoning, whether it's site assembly, whether it's just the risk of pre-development in an unproven market. We saw a lane there for us to kind of step into and begin to make some investments that the private sector wasn't doing. So we raised an initial $1.1 million in the spring of 2019. We had a lot of conversations with our potential investors about the structure for that fund. Frankly, it could have been a program-related investment through the Community Foundation. What we wound up doing is creating an independent C corporation through the Community Foundation. We had some conflicts among our investors. Some of them wanted to see a return on their investment, and others preferred to give money to the foundation through a donor advised fund with the intent of that money being returned over a period of time, but that money being returned to the donor advised fund, not to the original investor. So because we did have a couple of investors that wanted to see their capital returned to them plus some interest, we created the C Corporation. It was seeded with 6 investors, $1.1 million. We focused on pre-development, acquisition, and site assembly. We've gotten through 2 projects so far. We're in the midst of assembling a site for a 9% LIHTC deal downtown Holland. That's in partnership with First United Methodist Church and Dwelling Place out of Grand Rapids. They'll be the nonprofit developer. And our role really was to knock on doors and make sure that we could assemble the land adjacent to the church so that we had enough eligible property in a high scoring area under the LIHTC program to get that project moving. Nobody else really had the time or the patience or the capital to spend on that property acquisition element. And it looks like we're in good shape now to submit here either the next round in 2020 or the first round in 2021. I want to talk a little bit about how we had this initial conversation about putting the investment fund together, how we got where we got, and some of the things that we're going to do to move forward and hopefully grow this fund over time. So part of what we wanted to do is really cast a vision among our stakeholders in the Holland-Zeeland market with this initial development fund. And so we targeted our 15 largest employers in the region, all of which were within a 4-mile radius of downtown Holland or downtown Zeeland. They represented a little over 9,500 jobs, mostly semi-skilled and unskilled labor. For the most part at the time, they had starting wages between $12 and $15 an hour. Some of the other work that we've been doing about education among our human resources departments has increased that average starting wage to closer to $15 to $18 an hour for unskilled labor, just because they now recognize what it costs to actually live in the community. But that's really our target market. It's those manufacturing and service employees that are working 40 hours a week and still priced out of the local housing market. And we wanted to be able to talk to those 15 employers and have some kind of a cohesive strategy about what we were going to try to do. So we took our housing needs assessment data. This was data that was put together in 2018 with a national consultant. You can see those elements that are highlighted in dark orange that are labeled as priority high are our low and moderate income rental housing and our moderate and high income for sale housing. And we just didn't have anywhere near enough supply coming online in either of those categories and really needed to ramp that up. So having that data available to be able to talk to our employers about that was critical because we could show them the math. You know, we could show them this isn't like 25 or 30 additional housing units that we need to get built. We've got thousands of units that we need to be able to build over the next 5 years, or the problem of affordability is going to get worse. So if you remember back to that last slide, those dark blue circles represent our largest employers. The orange circles here represent our large multifamily projects that already exist. And then those light blue circles represent potential properties for new development that we either had access to already or had development partners that had access to that land where we knew we could build multifamily product or appropriate single family product for the market. And then we've included some purple lines in there just to give our partners a sense of what happens when we begin to think about how all of this aligns around a strategic transportation and mobility plan. Currently, there are, I think it's 6 bus lines that serve the area that is shown on this map. And we think it could be done pretty darn efficiently with 2 looped routes, potentially a 3rd high frequency route. And so what we want to do is tell a story about if we're able to build density along transit corridors over a period of time, we can also get more efficient with our transit service and provide a new alternative to mobility that's much better than the 1-hour headways that our transit service currently operates on. So yeah, I'm going to move on. The first project that we began to pitch, this was a parcel that was offered to us by one of the local philanthropic families. They'd owned this property for a long time. It's in the midst of manufacturing and rental market corridor. It's perfectly aligned with a long-term transportation plan. And it was about 17.5 acres. So we put together a preliminary concept plan with integrated architecture. We designed a LEED ND certified or potentially certified neighborhood with up to 236 units in a mixture of multi-unit, townhouse, and single family format with a fair amount of park space and green infrastructure built in. What you'll see at the bottom there is we identified this project as a mixed income project where what we wanted to do is combine 4% low-income housing tax credit financing with traditional market rate product. And in order to do this project well and to do it kind of as illustrated, we identified a gap of about $4.5 million. And that gap could be filled with a loan, but it needed to be essentially a flexibly termed loan. What we couldn't do is have hard debt that competed for collateral with a traditional loan. What we needed was a more forgiving lender. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The second project that we identified, also along the same transportation corridor, this is the old West Shore Mall, which has nearly all but died and transitioned into a new shopping center where most of the retail has been moved out of the old mall. This is the shops at West Shore now. Most of the retail has now been moved to the west along US 31. The old mall facility is almost entirely vacant, but has recently signed YMCA and Grand Rapids Community College as anchor tenants that will come ground that facility. We've already got county health and human services on this site just to the south and the east. And now we've got a plan for about 416 units in a combination of senior workforce townhome, single family, a product we're calling stacked flats, that can be built over the course of 3 or more phases and needs similarly about $4.5 million in gap financing. So both of the projects that I'm mentioning could get financed with traditional debt and equity, but what drives those projects then is profitability, right? And so the cost of the project, the cost of construction, means that those projects really need to rent for $1,000 a month and up in order to service that debt. We were able to then begin to look at low-income housing tax credit financing under the 4% program, which has historically been extremely difficult to use in our market for non-senior projects, mostly because the revenue limitations combined with the debt obligation make it really hard for these projects to cash flow, unless you've got some kind of a subsidiary debt instrument invested in the project. So initially we had a lot of conversations with MISHDA. We talked about our employers investing in their tax-exempt bonds. There are a lot of potential upsides to this, mostly the state's AA credit rating, almost no risk investment for our employers. It's basically like the way that you would invest a pension fund or a treasury bond. You know that money is going to come back and it's safe. The interest rate is low, typically maybe 2%, and the term is long. So a 40-year term is something, I'll again talk about this in a couple of minutes. It's hard to get our employers to think on a 40-year time horizon. So that's really the biggest barrier to the tax-exempt bond investment status, is getting our employers to be committed for $1 million, $2 million over a 40-year period of time. With the recognition, by the way, that unless they enter into a master lease agreement with the developer, they're not guaranteed that their employees, their specific employees, will get to live in the product that gets built, because we still have to satisfy all of the fair housing requirements. We can't reserve our units for their employees unless we have an independent lease agreement with those employers. So the other investment opportunity that we explored was a direct equity investment. We did have a number of potential employers that had some interest in this, but where this gets tricky is you're entering into a direct partner relationship in the project as an employer. And that means you've got to have a lot of trust between the employer and the developer. And it also means that if you've got multiple employers investing in a single project, those multiple employers are likely to have different risk profiles and tolerances. They're also likely to have different priorities. And so you end up with that classic scenario where you've got too many cooks in the kitchen who are all trying to make different decisions to satisfy their own needs. And that can complicate those projects. The other elements that are a bit of a downside for this investment platform is your higher risk exposure. So when you're directly invested in a project, if that project doesn't work out, you take the losses as the employer or as the investor. Those aren't mitigated because you're investing in a bond instrument or because you're investing in a pooled risk fund. So you've got a higher risk exposure. But the value of this kind of a tool is the shorter investment term and the higher potential yield. So on a project like this, typically you would be able to take your equity out after 7 to 10 years when the project gets refinanced. If it's a LIHTC deal, you'll be able to potentially take your equity out in 15 years. which is a pretty short period of time for affordable housing. And the return on investment potential is higher. So especially where you're doing mixed income and you're building in an adequate amount of amenities, those amenities drive price on your market rate units. And the more you're able to get a higher rate, market rate rent, the more profit you earn. And the more that allows you to subsidize rents on those more workforce-oriented housing units. But as I mentioned, putting together a development partnership with this kind of a conglomerate is difficult. We have not yet been successful on that front. But very much in line with what you just heard from the Mackinac Island example, we have had some success in talking through an intermediary loan fund through a CDFI. So a CDFI is a Community Development Finance Institute. Sonera is a great one for the state of Michigan. There are a few others. There's a great list. If you just Google CDFI Michigan, you'll find probably 10 or 11, but just a couple of them specialize in affordability. What that CDFI does is it's able to take in investments from employers, from the community foundation, from potential investors, and they essentially act as a pooled risk fund where you're investing in the CDFI itself, and everything that CDFI invests in across the state or the region or the country, whatever their investment platform looks like, you're not investing in a particular project. So you don't have the risk of that one project going south and losing your money. It is much more likely that the bulk of the projects that they're investing in are going to be at least mildly successful, and you'll get your capital back plus a little bit of interest. The other value of the intermediary loan fund is that the loan term is shorter than the tax-exempt bond investment. The tax-exempt bond is a 40-year investment. Again, it's hard to get our employers to think on that kind of a timeline. And so a 10 to 15-year loan term is much more palatable. As they've been experiencing talent shortages for almost that long already since the Great Recession, they're starting to realize that 10 to 15 years is about an adequate amount of time to be thinking about these issues. The other big added value beyond the direct equity partnership is having this experienced, relatively neutral third-party lender in the relationship, where both the investor and the developer can really lean on the CDFI because they've got expertise in the marketplace. They've done these deals before. They understand how to vet the pro forma, how to vet the construction costs. They can help to assuage any concerns that the investors may have, that the developer is sort of taking too much profit out of the deal and not providing enough return to the investors. And similarly, they can be a great translator back to the investors from the developer to really communicate the real costs of the project, the real time horizons, when we need to call capital. All of those things are really big value adds for projects like this. So in my last slide, what I want to talk about is the implications of COVID-19. We're still really kind of grasping to draw conclusions at this point. It's still pretty early. The federal assistance that has come through so far has been just enough to make sure that we don't have lots of people who are losing housing overnight. It sounds like there's additional federal legislation that could extend some of those eviction moratoriums, help people with additional stimulus checks, and send more money to HUD to be distributed across the states and localities. But what we're not seeing yet is any sort of long-term solutions. So what we're hearing from traditional lenders is a hesitation about new loan originations. So again, this makes a partnership with a CDFI even more compelling for us at this moment, because I think that they're still engaged in these projects and can add a great degree of credibility to some of these projects. If they're still in and invested, banks are going to be much more interested in continuing to talk about our deals. The other element is that our potential employer investors are much more focused on restarting their manufacturing operations and redefining what business as usual looks like. So getting them to engage with us in conversations about large-scale investments in medium and long-term projects is really off the table, probably for the next 60 to 90 days, we're anticipating. We're doing a lot of work to try to build the portfolio and be ready to go in with a very compelling case sometime this summer, we hope. But we want to be sensitive to what those manufacturers and employers have experienced over the last 60 days, really give them some time to redefine what the next phase of operations looks like. And then with our philanthropic partners, obviously they're dealing with the immediate crisis, making sure that anybody at risk of losing housing has the support through local rental assistance programs, emergency solutions grants, keeping our nonprofits afloat, making sure that they have access to PPP loans. So keeping their time and attention at this moment isn't realistic. What we're doing is really taking a pause, making sure that we are studying the market very closely, understanding the product that we need to be putting out there, and waiting for the right time to have those conversations. So happy to take any questions jointly with Sarah in any way you want to moderate.
Thank you, Ryan. I think we do have a few questions, and I think Stephanie may have
Sure.
those.
I can start the first one that I received, and it was specifically about the city agreeing to using their bonding authority. And was there any pushback from the city? And how long did it take them to agree to act as a partner? The city was on board pretty much from the get-go, because they were the ones that started the housing committee to create this, to find out what they needed. And as a little story to back that up, in the summer of 2018, the Department of Public Works interviewed 8 applicants for 2 positions. 4 of the applicants were offered jobs, and all 4 turned down the job, citing that there was no available housing. That same summer, the public school hired a preschool teacher, and due to lack of housing, the teacher turned down the job. So we're trying to build up our professional base, and we have no housing for them. It's not a lack of affordability; it's the lack of availability. I was also asked about did we raise additional funds? We did not. We had those funds available to us. The first for the property was a field of interest / donor advised. We advised with the donor to better understand if it still fit the purpose of the fund. So we spoke with them, but recognized that this fit along with their purpose. And then the rest of the funds that were being used last year and this year, they're coming from our unrestricted and from some of our medical funds. In hindsight, would we have done that? Because we are losing some of our restricted funds. We knew that by making these grants that it would be less for some of our nonprofits this year, and at the fall of last year. But we also recognized that if we didn't have this housing available, that these organizations wouldn't really have anyone to continue to work with in the future. So we felt it was a win-win for everybody.
Okay. Thanks, Stephanie.
Yep.
No, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that answers those 2 questions, I'm pretty sure.
Okay, I have a question for both of you. If you have any advice on first steps for organizations that are trying to raise funds either for a specific project or for a general housing fund, what are some of the first things that you considered and some of the first obstacles you had to overcome? Maybe we can start with Stephanie.
We were lucky enough that because this project had been in the press so often over these past 20 years, that we had built up a housing fund from a couple of donors that had built expendable funds. And so we didn't have to go out and fundraise for this. We did have the funds. And mind you, just so you know, we're not a large organization. We have less than $12 million. So we really work on a shoestring budget throughout the year. But again, we felt that this was the time and the place to make sure that we use those funds. Ryan?
Yeah, so we really started with data. It was pretty clear from the beginning that much as Mackinac Island experienced, we had a lot of people talking about housing, but no clear data to back up where the need was. And so we spent a fair amount of time collecting really specific data about the kind of housing that we did have available and what our vacancy rate was, and then comparing that to our economic growth projections for the region to understand how much more growth are we likely to experience, what's our shortage of housing today, what does a healthy vacancy rate look like, and therefore how many more units do we need and at what price point. And that made it much easier for us to make the case with our employers and with our local philanthropic partners that there was a critical need, it wasn't being satisfied with the local marketplace, and we had some breakdowns in the system. So with data, we were able to kind of get over that initial hump of credibility. But then it was really about storytelling. It was about coming up with a compelling vision for both the project and for the region as a whole. It was about bringing in partners that had political clout, who could get us in the room with folks who could make decisions and write checks. And so that was really me taking a back seat to much more important players a lot of the time. If I could queue up data and kind of provide some narrative, I really leaned on our economic development partners and our community foundation and our Chamber of Commerce to help get us in the door and have initial conversations. And if our employers or investors warmed to the idea, I might come into the conversation much later down the road. But it was using those partners who had credibility in the community to help tell the story and make sure that we had buy-in before we showed up with our hands out.
Sarah, I wholeheartedly agree with Ryan. It is having the data behind us along with those stories. Many of our property owners, homeowners were really worried about their property taxes going up because of this bond issue. But in the end, it was still the employers, it was the businesses that were going to be taking the bulk of it. And in fact, our bonding is so little here on the island. And in fact, our property taxes aren't that high, especially if you're a year-round homeowner, because there's so many second homes here. So that kind of changes the infrastructure as well. But again, we did a lot of talking to the press, to city council. We attended a lot of meetings to make sure that the public was well educated about why we needed this and why we needed to make sure that those that are protecting us had a home to live in.
And just to follow up on that point, and maybe just to confirm for my own reference, you did that messaging before there was a specific project. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
And
yeah.
And Ryan, when you started approaching investors, you already had developed this structure for this risk pool. Is that correct, or was that kind of developed after approaching investors?
Yeah, we sort of built the plane in flight. So we approached investors once we had the data and we had some narrative around the data, and then really asked them, one, do they have an interest in being problem solvers with us and collaborators? And two, what are the constraints that they feel they need to place on putting capital into the market? And so as they began to define their constraints, we started to design our fund around the constraints that they articulated to us. And that took some time. It took us at least a year to put together something that we thought was salient to everybody involved. And it wouldn't have been our preferred structure to begin with, and probably in hindsight, we might have done it a little bit differently. But what we wanted to make sure of was that our most likely investors felt like they had a real hand in the process of designing the system.
Okay, great, thank you. We have another question on community investment funds, where non-accredited investors can invest. Ryan, have you had any experience with that?
We haven't done anything with that yet. I know that the city of Detroit has a couple of programs in the works right now. I was just doing some furious Googling to see if I could find the name. I know I've got a business card somewhere that I can forward on. I see that was Derek's question. I appreciate that you've already identified the barrier for non-accredited investors. For anybody that's not familiar with that term, very often to be a traditional investor in a development deal, you've got to be an accredited investor under the SEC filing regulations, which means you need to have a net worth of $1 million or more, or satisfy one of a handful of other requirements. And it puts up a pretty big barrier to local folks who want to share in the growth and wealth creation in their community and also contribute to important projects. We've identified it as a long-term priority, but not a short-term priority. So it's probably something we'll take a closer look at over the next couple of years. But in the more immediate future, what we're trying to do is preserve the existing housing that we have so that we don't lose any more of it, and then get enough product in the pipeline that we're starting to at least put a release valve in the system so that we don't have all this competition for a limited amount of supply.
Thank you. A couple of questions for Stephanie. One is about connections to the city's sewer system and necessity for a large drain field. And there's also a question about the use of tax increment financing to help pay back the bond on that project. Stephanie, could you speak to those questions?
So the first about the drain field and the city water, the city is obviously worried about having to do a larger sewer system, and with that particular, the original unit, with it being as many people that were going to be on that unit, they didn't think that they could, that particular unit organization could fit into the sewer system that was already there, and that they would have to create their own drain field. I wasn't involved too much then. I just know that it was not going to be able to go through the city's infrastructure. But with only 24 units compared to 100 units, they felt that it was a much better suited for the infrastructure that is here now. Again, not being in the DPW, but that's the basic core of it, is along those lines. The city, I don't know. Again, it was Sinair and the city's lawyers that decided to do the bonding. The city had done their first bond less than 6 months beforehand to purchase a dock for the island. Interesting, the island had no dock of its own. So an opportunity arose that they were able to buy a dock to ensure that the island residents could get on and off the island in the summer and in the winter. So they learned a lot about bonds, and they felt that that was still the best way to finance it, and at 2.7%, and they were able to do it in under 15 years. So they were comfortable with that.
Great. Ryan, we have a question on whether or not there was any effort to get large employers to provide property for housing projects for their own employees versus targeting projects for the general public.
We had some conversation about that. The difficulty was what we didn't have was a couple of things. We didn't have an employer that wanted to be the only investor. And then we didn't have multiple employers that wanted to invest in somebody else's property, right? So we weren't going to get Gentex to invest in property that Hayworth owned and hope that their employees would drive the 2.5 miles from the Hayworth property to their site. The other element of that was really about wanting to have at least 1 degree of separation, or I should say 2 degrees of separation, between the employer and the employee. It's important that you think about how complicated a relationship between an employee and an employer can get when not only do you rely on that employer for your income, but you also rely on them for your housing. There can be some interesting dynamics of both power and control that enter in. And not that we would ever assume that any of our employers would exploit any of their workers for any reason. But even the perception of power changes when you are relying on your employer for housing. And so we didn't want to have that direct tie, at least not for the first project or two. That being said, we do have employers that are sitting on land that they think they probably don't need. And so what we're trying to think through is, does any of that land make sense for development relative to kind of the patterns that we have around the rest of the community? And as we've defined our priorities, what we really want to be doing is getting people as close as possible to neighborhood amenities that already exist, so that they have mobility choices. Because as I've talked a lot about before, for anybody who's heard me speak about this, transportation is just as critical an issue as housing is in this overall economic scenario. And if we're giving households the ability to go from a 2-car to a 1-car household, because somebody is able to walk to work or bike to work or take public transportation to work, that's the fastest way that I can save somebody $400 a month. If they don't have to pay for gas and a car payment and auto repairs and blown tires, that's a significant savings every month that is really difficult for us to just show up with cash. But if we can place housing developments along transportation lines or within walking distance to employment, that's a great bonus. So it's getting that balance right. Can I get to the grocery store? Can I get to my job? Can I get my kids to school? And finding sites that satisfy all of those requirements is really our top priority.
Sorry, I was muted there. Thank you, Ryan. Do we have any other questions?
Sarah, I just want to back up Ryan about employee housing. Mackinac Island has a lot of employee housing, and some of it is even year-round. And we did recognize that by having their own housing, they could then make a change in order to get into higher paying jobs that didn't have housing provided to them, and maybe even be able to move up their professional ladder. So we were hoping, so we very much recognized that we needed to make sure that this housing was not tied to an employer, so that they could have some freedom in their choices in employment.
That's a great point. We've had a lot of conversations about that because there have been so many employers that have had to step up and actually become partners at some level in either buying housing or creating boarding houses. And that's always a concern, is about how closely can you be tied to your employer. So great point. Any other questions or final points that either of the two of you might want to make?
John O'Neill has a question.
Yes, hi. I know this is a bit off to the side, but it's an issue that I strongly believe is very quickly going to take center stage, and unless we prepare for it, we're going to get caught really blindsided. And that is with the, economists are telling us that we're really entering a very serious economic downturn. And it's all well and good to plan new affordable rental and homes for sale, but I'm not sure that market's going to persist. Number one. Number two is we are about to be hit by a wave of foreclosures, and unless we really act proactively and not wait for some program to come down from on high, either from the state or from the federal government, we're going to lose a large number of our currently affordable homes. and we can't build our way out of that problem. So I'd like to, broach that topic and ask, so often we fight the last war, and really it's an entirely different scenario that we're facing now. I'd like to open the discussion to that. It was sort of touched on a little bit, but I don't think we are going to be looking at a lot of people in a position to purchase homes right now. I think what we really need to do is to focus on preserving the homes that are affordable now. Anyone care to speak to that?
I'm happy to take a stab at that, John. I'm not going to pretend that I have a crystal ball or that I'm an expert in that field. I think you're right that preservation is a critical issue at this moment and needs to be the top priority. One of our priorities has been to ensure that both homeowners and renters have emergency rental assistance or emergency mortgage assistance. And getting those funds out over the first 90 days of this COVID crisis was a top priority of our philanthropic partners and many of our housing providers in the marketplace. A lot of this is unfortunately dependent on how the federal government moves. And I completely agree with you that waiting for the federal government to solve local problems is not a good recipe. But the size and scale of the potential problem is well beyond our capacity in terms of funding at the local level. So, I think lessons learned from 2008 foreclosure crisis, though the origins of that were much different, were a couple of things that I think are important to be thinking about. One is the importance of having a county land bank authority that is prepared, that is able to take properties and really think about how they reposition those assets when they become available. Two is having a local investment fund that's able to buy those foreclosed properties and keep them out of the hands of out-of-state investors. What we have found in the Grand Rapids metro area and the Holland region is that a lot of the foreclosures in 2009 and 2010 were bought by private equity firms in 2011, 2012, 2013. And they essentially bought packaged assets. So they bought 10 or 15 or 20 houses at a time from a bank within a particular geographic area. And those investors had zero local connections. Oftentimes it was a private equity firm based in New Jersey or Connecticut. And they were looking at spreadsheets and trying to determine what can we charge in rent, and really didn't have any concern for what are the needs in the local market. It was more about an asset class and ensuring that they were being as profitable as possible on that investment, which is frankly how capitalism works, but that did not work out well for many of our homeowners. And it's really, it's had a big impact on the availability of for sale housing supply in that moderate income price point. And so I think the big risk is that we would lose more of those assets to outside investors who will rent those homes out at higher prices than they would otherwise mortgage for. And so I think preparing for those two things is really important, and having the financing available to do those, while also recognizing, and this is the last thing I'll say, we still anticipate a growing employment market. And frankly, I think the Grand Rapids and Holland metro region may grow faster over the next 4 or 5 years because there are going to be impacts on rural communities that are more severe than they are on urban communities in terms of job loss. And so I anticipate seeing some rural migration into urban areas where there's a greater prevalence of job opportunity. And that's only going to increase competition for housing over the next few years. And so I want to keep my eye on both balls, one being housing preservation and the other being ensuring that we have enough new supply coming online to satisfy additional folks who are likely to migrate into our more urban environments.
Thanks, Ryan. That was a great explanation. And I would just add to that in terms of the supply. We've been dealing with an undersupply for so many years that adding new housing stock is going to be necessary in addition to preservation of existing housing stock. No matter what we do, we need to add new units. So like Ryan said, keep an eye on both balls. So,
Hey,
well,
Sarah, could I have one thing to that?
sure.
This Carmen Aventini. I think what we learned in the recession is that the banks really don't want to foreclose on properties. I think they're going to avoid that to the extent possible. And since we did bail them out during the last recession, I think it would be a good idea for us to push our legislators, and I apologize for the dog barking in the background. And I think we should push our federal legislators to work with the banks and set up a longer term mortgage loan deferral program, because if this does drag out for like a year or two, rather than foreclosing all these properties, the federal government can help fund them deferring them over that longer period of time until they're back on their feet and working again. Because the banks would lose much more money foreclosing on properties than if they tried to work with folks to keep their mortgages. I think they learned that the last time around. But there will have to be some kind of federal incentive, whether it's a direct cash payment or a tax credit or something like that. Because I've had the same thoughts that you have, John, that that's something we really need to be worried about. And that, at least to me in big picture, is the best way to deal with that problem, because I don't think any of us want to see the foreclosures again.
I think everyone in every part of the economy has scars from the last recession on that front. And I think everyone is watching that really carefully. That's definitely an issue that we're going to have to discuss in more detail. And it might be an opportunity for another, virtual housing roundtable, or maybe even someday a real life housing roundtable discussion where we can actually get together and see each other in person and talk through some of these big questions. I'm going to wrap up for today. It's getting close to 3:30, but again, want to thank Ryan and Stephanie for participating today and leading the conversation and giving us an opportunity to learn about their work in other parts of the state. And I'm hopeful that we can, continue the dialogue as we move forward with different efforts to find and create new housing revenues. So thanks again, Ryan and Stephanie, and for all of you who are participating today in our first attempt at a virtual discussion board. So nice to see you all, those of you who are out there, and feel free to contact myself or Lisette or Yarrow with any questions as follow-up. I mentioned earlier we will be sending out a survey, so keep your eyes open for that, and we'll stay in touch. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah.